been doing these testing takeaway videos for a number of years, and I have to say this one is going to be a little bit different because pre-season testing has been a little bit different because it's so close and really quite unpredictable. Yeah, there has been a little bit of the predictable performances from some teams like Haas or Sauber who may have a little bit of ground to make up. But it's clear that the midfield has closed up enormously, and in fact it's really hard to predict even who is at the front. Nonetheless, with all of that said, here are my testing takeaways. Lewis in the red car is what we've all been waiting to see. I was stood on the platform of Stevenage Station near my home when I heard the news that Lewis Hamilton was going to switch from Mercedes to Ferrari. So this pre-season test has been really interesting to see how the 7-time world champion has been embedding into the red team. When he first arrived at the team, it all looked really positive. He seemed to be really happy. He said he felt at home. And even in the first couple of days of the test, his messaging and his whole demeanour, he looked like a man who was quite happy to be driving the car and happy with what's going on. And we were all getting ready for what looked like it could have been a title fight between Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. However, on day 3 of the test, things seemed to change ever so slightly. The tone of Hamilton in the press conference shifted somewhat. He didn't seem as happy with the car, and even his lap times didn't look quite as strong through the longer runs as we expected them to. And I think people like Mercedes, Red Bull and some of the others may be a bit closer than we think. So Hamilton may not be in for such an easy ride in the Italian team as we all thought at first. There could not be a better season to be a rookie in Formula 1. Yeah, that's right, with a major rule change coming at the end of the season ahead of 2026, a huge amount of the engineering staff at every single team is going to be focused on developing a completely different car to the one the rookies are driving this year, to the point where some teams have already switched off a lot of their development on this year's car. And in some cases, that means the pressure is kind of off. Sauber, for example, transitioning to becoming the works Audi team next year. That's where all of their attention is. So for drivers like Bortoleto, there's not a lot of pressure. But in some cases, drivers like Kimi Antonelli, he's got a lot to prove. He's in the works Mercedes seat alongside George Russell. And that is a hot seat to be in. A lot of people want his job. At Red Bull Racing, Liam Lawson is in the hot seat alongside Max Verstappen, and officially he is a rookie, even though he's got a little bit of experience under his belt now. However, for Lawson, there's a huge pressure on him because you might think for a young driver, driving for Red Bull Racing would be a dream job. Absolutely, but if your teammate is Max Verstappen, well, just have a look and see what happened to Sergio Perez, an incredibly talented driver. And look where he is now. So huge pressure on Liam Lawson. Doohan down at Alpine, also another driver who has a lot of pressure on him as well. Just a single race under his belt. And at Alpine, well, maybe that pressure's a little bit reduced. The team is another team in a transitional year. All he has to do is stay as close as possible to his teammate Pierre Gasly. But Gasly is a proven race winner. Will Doohan be able to raise his game to meet that level? Because if he does, there's not too much left for him to prove. Then look at Red Bull's newly renamed junior team, Racing Bulls. Isaac Hadjar taking the second seat alongside Yuki Tsunoda, a driver many people expected to be promoted to the main Red Bull team instead of Liam Lawson. And there are still rumours around exactly how those driver lineups will end up by the end of the year. And that is a challenging thing for them to take a look at. Finally, a driver who perhaps has the least pressure on him, apart from maybe Bortoleto, Ollie Bearman. He proved himself pretty well in Saudi Arabia last year driving for Ferrari, then got a substitution into the main Haas team, who he's now driving for the rest of the year. Well, Haas have had a relatively quiet test, and apart from a moment where the car decided to self-destruct slightly going down the main straight, Bearman's also had quite a quiet test, just getting on with it. While the lap times haven't been spectacular, that's the way of Haas in 2025. That car could be a little bit of a dark horse, at least in the early races of the year. But for Haas too, they are also focusing quite heavily on next year's car. So for Bearman, all he has to do is keep going and try to match Esteban Ocon all the way through the year. And so far, it looks pretty good. The weather. In a surprise to absolutely nobody, I want to talk about the weather, because in Bahrain, you're in the middle of the desert. There's no real weather to talk about. It's hot during the day and cold at night, except for this year, it seems. It's been cold all of the time. Track temperatures below 30 degrees centigrade consistently throughout the test, and the air temperature as low as 15 degrees Celsius as well. That, in Formula One terms, is absolutely perishing cold. You might as well be testing in the Arctic Circle, or as we call it at this time of year, Silverstone. We actually saw intermediate tyres even used at one point in Bahrain, and that's just unimaginable in most normal conditions. Nonetheless, that has really skewed everybody's run plans. And because of those cold conditions, you start to wonder which teams that might favour. Well, in the past, Mercedes always looked good when it was cold. Think back to Las Vegas, one of the coldest races on the calendar, even though once again you're in the middle of the desert. Maybe there's a little bit of a theme here. But the Mercedes, whilst it's not looked bad, hasn't looked massively better than everybody else in these conditions. So it does show to me that the form has shifted, and you can't use the hot-cold form book to predict who's going to be good or bad. But what it does mean is a lot of the data that the teams have gathered over all 3 days has to be slightly caveated in the engineering offices, saying, well, our car looked really good in this condition, but when we turn up the temperature, different air densities, different car performance, different tyre performance, we just hope it all still works. And if somebody gets their extrapolation on the mathematics that they all do on their laptops when they get back to the factory wrong, well, you are going to see some really surprising results in Melbourne. Assuming it's hot and sunny, which it always is in Australia, isn't it? Flow visualization. One of the big talking points of this year's test has quite clearly been the sheer amount of bright green dye applied to almost everybody in the field, as if other colours aren't available. In fact, I did almost have to go and check the sporting and technical regulations to see if bright green flow visualization dye had been mandated by the FIA at some point, and I'd missed it. No, Mercedes still have their corporate looking blue-grey flow visualization dye they use on their car, and a few other teams did have a few spots of other different colours of dye other than the bright green. Well, McLaren probably used up half the world's supply of bright green ink on their car on the first day of testing, plastering it all the way down the left-hand side of the car, then realising the entire world could see what their airflow is doing. Yep, you can see how the air is flowing over the bodywork of the car. It's a great tool for the engineers to understand what the real car is doing and how they can compare that to the wind tunnel and to the virtual wind tunnel computational fluid dynamics. But it also means everybody else can see it, including our very high quality cameras on the side of the track. For me though, the big surprise is that everybody is using so much of this flow visualization technique. A few years ago, nobody in Formula One used Flow-Vis dye at all. It's not a new technology, it's been around forever. But they decided to use it in such large quantities tells us that actually teams are maxing out their wind tunnel allocations and need to make every little bit of running that they have with a real car on a real track really, really valuable. You have to ask the question though, is it a little bit of confidence or even overconfidence from McLaren to put such a large amount of Flow-Vis on their car in such a public way? Do they think they're that good? I actually think it was a bit of an oversight and they realised slightly too late. They did manage to block one photographer, but as I said, they didn't block our cameras, did they? The question of Red Bull. Red Bull Racing for me has been utterly intriguing. Quite frankly, a lot of people thought they were sandbagging with their car as it arrived for the first 2 days of testing. It didn't look particularly spectacular, it looked a little bit hard to drive, and it also looked, externally at least, almost identical to the car they finished the season with last year. Closer inspection showed it's actually quite different underneath the bodywork. However, the car didn't seem to improve as the test went on, even into the final day, and then Red Bull put an upgrade package on it and the car seemed to work. It didn't seem super easy to drive. Lawson seemed to struggle, Verstappen seemed to struggle, but it did all start to come together as night fell on the final day and the speed came out of the Red Bull, showing that Max Verstappen is still the man to beat in Formula One. But last year the car became massively beatable. Will it become beatable again? We're going to have to wait to Melbourne to find that one out. Even with all of that said, for me, it remains utterly impossible to come up with a really reliable pecking order because you see weird results. Pierre Gasly, for example, looked really strong on the final day in the Alpine. A year-old car. It doesn't seem quite right, does it? Max Verstappen, he was off the pace for a lot of the sessions, as we said, but then came good. McLaren, they seem to be there or thereabouts, but Mercedes, big questions about how quick George Russell truly is. And then the Ferraris, I can't really believe that with a complete new car concept, Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc, they're going to be a long way from the front. I think they're going to be right at the sharp end. So that's an awful lot of cars I've already said are going to be at the front. Then you get strange cars that could perform really well in certain conditions and on certain tracks. Looking at you, Williams, looking at you, Haas, and I think a few of the other back-of-the-field runners may work their way through in certain occasions, leading us to what I am certain is going to be one of the most unpredictable seasons of Formula One that anybody has ever seen. And quite frankly, I cannot wait. See you in Melbourne.